thought of the sermonette that was given and to know that Hosea is a very, very up-to-date book as far as talking about things that are on the front page headlines of our newspapers, and it's just amazing. We had the opportunity in our area to cover the minor prophets, and it took us a while to get through Hosea, but there was just so much that tied into what we see going on in the world. As far as other things that I might mention, just like here, our congregation, Tampa, has been gradually growing. It's been nice to see that. And just recently, Mr. Roy Holliday was officially asked to be in charge of ministerial services. Victor Kubik realizes he can't be everywhere and do everything. So that's probably not a big surprise, but he's already been doing it. And otherwise, I think everything continues as it has been. Thought of what to talk about today, and I chose a subject that I think I touched on once before. But let's begin. Once upon a time, there was a tyrannical husband who demanded that his wife conform to rigid standards of his choosing. She was to do certain things for him as a wife, mother, and homemaker. In time, she came to hate her husband as much as she hated the list of his rules and regulations. Then one day he died, mercifully as far as she was concerned. Sometime later, she fell in love with another man and lived on a perpetual honeymoon. Her husband was committed to her and to her interests. Joyfully, she devoted herself to his happiness and welfare. One day, she ran across, though, a list of do's and don'ts that her first husband had brazenly given her. To her amazement, she found that she was doing for her second husband all of the things that her first husband had demanded of her. But yet never once did he suggest any of these things. She did them as an expression of her love for him and her desire to please him. He had won her by his demonstration of selfless love. This was an actual account compiled by James Hewitt in his book, Unlimited Illustration. So many times God will ask man to do something. Think not that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets, and mankind will think so. Don't go after other gods. Man goes after other gods. Keep the Sabbath. Many people choose not to keep the Sabbath. But one thing that man is very willing to do, it has been very popular in the past, prophesied to be popular up until the end time, that God encouraged man to do, is to get married. What I'd like to talk about in our time together is that you and I can have a wonderful marriage. One thing that is important to note is, and maybe I've done this before, all of us are either married or may get married in the future. All of us are related to people that could be married, or maybe that are, where we might be able to help be a guide or steering guide, an influential person, to help with others in their relationships. But one way or another, that subject touches all of us. And we've got people that have said, well, it'll never happen to me. We've had people in Tampa in their 80s and 90s that have gotten married or remarried. And you just never know. But marriage is governed by spiritual principles. Over in Jeremiah chapter 10, we see an interesting statement that applies to human beings, and something that is not well understood in society, and it's something that I could not even fathom until I came into the church years ago. Chapter 10 and verse 23. Here it says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. 10:23. It is not in the way of man to direct and walk and direct his steps. We naturally don't do the right thing all the time. And when it comes to the subject of marriage, God calls it a mystery, because most people will go into a marriage thinking, here's something that fulfills my desires, my hopes, my dreams. This is something that I can get. And the more they try to get, after the honeymoon wears off, it becomes elusive. It's like grabbing air and coming up with nothing. The mystery is that by giving, with the intent not to give to get, but just giving, that we will end up reaping very positive results. That by giving, we end up receiving even the things that we would want. And since that is lost on society, God calls it a mystery. Let's take a look at that over in Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31. Ephesians 5:31. Actually, the whole chapter, or much of the chapter, discusses the subject of marriage and being in subjection one to another, and that the husband should give his life for his wife as Christ, the head of the church, did for the body of the church. But we move on, as Paul summarizes, in verse 31, he says, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, be joined unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh." This is a great mystery. And the mystery is the summation of this description of a relationship through much of chapter 5. Man naturally thinks, the natural inclination is that to be happy, you must get all that you can. And that's the way most people approach life. You know, I can't be happy until I attain the American dream, have my hacienda, my place, my retirement, my job. And some of these things are just fine of and by themselves if it's not an obsession. But what can a person be happy if a person doesn't obtain all of that? Well, of course, if that person is in harmony with God and God's ways. But in giving, it can be the best of all worlds. When I approach a subject like this, I think it's appropriate and important to say at the outset that it may be that a number of people that have been divorced and it was not their fault. You know, statistics can be impersonal and, quote, unfairly paint everybody with the same brush. I mention that because in counseling you can find that there might be extenuating circumstances, some that might involve complicated factors that maybe did not exist at the beginning of a marriage, issues of burgeoning addictions or increasing abuse or violence, as well as other extreme conditions. That may not be a common thing, but too many of our people have unfortunately had those experiences and they were not of their own choosing. Of course, too many people did not really know the other person by the time of their marriages. But the question, the proactive question is, well, where do we go from here? Again, we are married or we could be married in the future regardless of age. Our youth need to know, and hence one of the reasons for a subject like this, our youth need to know that they are in the grace of God who decrees that they are entitled to have a happy marriage. That is something that every young person should be able to anticipate. Of course, there's information, ways, biblical principles to be familiar with. We all know that. And all of the rest of us who are married have the potential to make our marriages even better. And all of us have relatives that we are in a position to sometimes encouragingly influence in this area. So the bottom line is that all of us should feel optimistic about this subject. God wants this subject to be as important to us as it is to Him. God will marry Christ. And sometimes people might think, well, does God really know how I feel or some of the challenges that I have had in my relationships? Yes, He does. And if you read the book of Hosea, those first 3 chapters, He told Hosea to marry somebody that was wayward. And in a sense, He was saying, I want people to know what it's like for me because God has gone through anguish in His marriage with ancient Israel. And He says, I'm choosing a prophet, in this case Hosea, to go through the same experience. And he can write down some of the same feelings that I've had. He feels even greater than we do because he's a spirit being. And he knows what it's like to be totally elated and happy with people and people that are in sync with him. And people like David and others would sing praises and be in total harmony. And he would know through Jesus Christ that this would be part of the mate, that the church would be wedded to him. And he's very excited, anticipating that. And one of the final thoughts in the entire Bible is over in Revelation 19:7, where the wife will make herself ready. So he's very, very optimistic about the subject. In fact, he's so dedicated to Israel that he said, even though Israel didn't follow my laws and keep my statutes and so forth, and I had to give her a bill of divorcement, he says in Jeremiah 3, he says, but you know what? After I die through Jesus Christ that broke the marriage, he says, I'm going to marry her again. This time I'm putting the laws into her heart. And in Jeremiah 31, it says, a new covenant will I make. It's the other covenant that I already had, but it will be more binding. So God is very, very passionate about this subject and looks forward to having a special relationship with the church. And he wants that for people now. He's mentioned that in one of the first institution after the establishment or identification of the Sabbath revealed to mankind was the institution of marriage. It's a very important topic, and the strength of the church and society depends on it. One of the mysteries, or the primary mystery to the world, to society, that marriage is not a 50-50 proposition, is that it has to be more than that. I've known some people that have told me in years gone by, when we get along, we do everything 50-50. I do my half, she does her half. Perhaps this was best illustrated by an elderly couple that went to McDonald's and ordered one hamburger, 24 French fries, 1 cup of coffee, plus an extra empty cup, plus an extra plate. They sat there and methodically divided up the French fries, 12 for one, 12 for the other. They cut the little hamburger in half. And so he started eating his hamburger, and she was sitting there with hers in front of her watching him. The manager came over and said, well, that's such a small meal. You don't have to split this. I'll tell you what. Let me just give you another sandwich and another cup of coffee and a few more French fries. She says, no, you don't have to do that. I'm totally happy here. She says, you realize that we have a 50-50 marriage. We have divided everything. Yes, but you're not eating. And she answered, well, it's his turn with the teeth. A bit unrealistic? Seldom is life 50-50. I remember one woman who said that had been married happily for about 60 years. And she was a nurse, and she was spending a lot of time helping her husband. And I said to her, well, that's quite a gesture of dedication. She says, no. She says, I am simply repaying George for all the assistance he gave me all the years earlier when I was in difficulty. Now, Paul Harvey years ago cited the list of the Tournament of Roses, marriages that were 50 or more years. And I know that I have had spent time talking to people that have been married that long, much or longer. Anybody here married for 50 years? Well, there you go. That's something we could applaud, I suppose. I mean, that's significant. That's not an accident. It certainly is not. All the people that I've talked to that have been married 50, 60, even longer in time, all of them have said, candidly, it wasn't just hunky-dory, peaches and cream, not a single problem. But none of them were conditional. None of them were conditional. There was one couple that was at the altar, and the minister asked the typical questions to the groom and then was going to the bride. And the questions were actually a series of 7. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer? That's 7 questions. And so he thought for a minute, do you take her as your lawfully wedded wife? Yes. Well, in sickness or in health, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. So his answers were yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Well, that's not according to the rules, not in our church. That's not part of the church ceremony. The answer is yes, unequivocally, all across the board. But people have this mentality, 50-50. So what happens if somebody has a cold and they can't give their 50? So they're at 49%. Does the other person retract? Well, I'm keeping a score here. I'm withdrawing to 49%. Then, well, if tit for tat, I think that person went to 48, so I'll go to 47. Then you've got 40-40, and then 30-30, and then 20-20, and then there's not any communication going on. I don't think you'll find that in God's church, but you do find that in society. And people get frustrated. They'll call up talk show hosts, and psychologists will say, not that all psychology is wrong, but some of these people just, in a blanket statement, well, if you're not getting anything out of the relationship, you better cut out now. What does the church say in the ceremony? In sickness and in health? In better circumstances or in adverse circumstances? There's nothing in the Bible about 50-50. It does say that it's more blessed to give than to receive. Giving does not have to translate into meaning giving up. Oh man, if I just give, there's nothing left. It comes back to us. Directly and indirectly, it comes back to us. I know some people met a person on the phone who is interested in church, and I was just dumbfounded. She's 91 years old. Her mind's pin sharp. She just says, well, I have a few aches and pains, but what's that? I've lived a good life, and I've gotten to travel here. And she had a famous relative whose uncle just took her all over the world from an early age, and she says, life is just fun, she says. She has a merry feast. She gives of herself. She gives of her time. Her husband needs her help, and has a condition of Alzheimer's, and she's helping him. And she doesn't see the hole in the donut. She sees the donut. She's happy. She's doing things, and she's so thankful to God, so thankful for her blessings, and talks about them and gives to others. And it eventually keeps coming back to her, and she's happy for everything that comes back. That's a kind of a cycle that a Christian should have. Even with the Apostle Paul, with all the difficulties that he had. 3 times he was shipwrecked, stoned, beaten, maligned, ridiculed, chased out of town, trouble from without, trouble from within, etc. He had a merry feast, as it says in Proverbs, a joyful heart, a merry feast, positive, optimistic all the time. Well, in relationships, that is what is supposed to happen. And it's a mystery to so many that thought, well, I thought that I had it, and it just evaporated, so they think. Everything is cause and effect. Now, without God's Spirit, without the understanding of what the mystery is, and it's not 50-50, it's 100-100. The proposition, reach out to the other person, take care of and address whatever those needs are, and it all returns. A Christian's going to want to do that no matter what, but sometimes being human, we can be frustrated if we don't see a reciprocation coming back in our direction. When you have a 50-50 mentality and you have an absence of everything going right, as one minister said in all of his many years of marriage counseling, he says the common theme that I would say is the man has got his mind totally on himself. He's totally self-absorbed. And his frustrated wife says, I don't care what he asks me. I'm not doing anything that he wants anymore. That's a natural result of having a conditional marriage. And that's dangerous because, we're assuming at 50-50, I'll always have my health, she'll always have hers. I'll always have my income, that'll always be enough. Or both of ours, or whatever the arrangement is. And then when things erode in certain areas, then it's a challenge because there's no concept of going over and beyond. The man can say, why should I do for her, when she turns into my critic? And then she responds, well, if you really loved me, I wouldn't belittle him. Well, if she really loved me, I would be more inspired to give to her. Well, I'm open for change, but he has to give in first. Well, I'm willing to change, but what if it's one-sided? Do I give up what little I have? Or so he thinks. People usually resist marriage counseling for the same reasons that they refuse to go beyond the 50-50 relationship. And that's because they think they're going to miss out on something. Yet, according to the Bible, they're already obligated by the marriage covenant. What typically happens in society is that people will say, oh, we may live together, but I'm not going to make any commitment so that I can weasel out of the relationship if I don't continually get what I want. We live in a very selfish society, 2 Timothy 3. It's self-absorbed. It doesn't have to be that way. There are exceptions. In Ephesians 5 and verse 25, it says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. As a husband, would we be willing to run into a burning building to save our wives? Would we be willing to give to them whatever we have? Would we be willing to help her if she's tired? Wash the dishes, mop the floor, sweep the driveway, help with the laundry, help with the children, sit down, talk, whatever it is. Willing to support and understand emotional needs. A woman wants a man she can look up to, but one who will not look down on her. If all men gave beyond the 50-50, if all men gave for their wives as Christ did for the church, women's liberation would die. It would die a slow death. I remember when I attended University of Vermont, this is back when the dinosaurs were alive. But back then, even women's liberation was alive and well. And I remember one poster, we don't need men. Come on down to the Women's Center. Learn to change your own oil. Rap about car mechanics and so forth. We don't need these guys, these thugs. All power to the sisters. And there was some support for that. And I don't belittle those that attended. It's because they never saw a sacrificial example, perhaps, in their lives. They didn't know that life could be better than what they saw. And what they saw wasn't very ideal. And if I were in that situation, I'd be down there trying to learn to change my own oil, too. It's true. But there is the old adage, and this is true, and sometimes it's the husband that's the key. If a husband treats his wife like a thoroughbred, she will not turn into an old nag. Or better yet, treat his wife like royalty. If she knows she is special to him, he will be special to her. The best thing that a man can do is to love his wife. Best thing a man can do is to love his wife, to give. More about the nagging later, but doesn't necessarily mean that she's a bad person or that everything was initially her fault. But it is a natural condition when a woman feels like she's lost control. I've got no leverage. What else can I do? And yet there are other things that could happen. There was an interesting discussion that Dr. Laura Schlesinger had with a 37-year-old man that shows what can happen when a wife strives to meet the interests of her husband. I'll just go back and forth from what one can do to what the other can do. And I think this was very, very penetrating. This man seemed to have a clear understanding of the relationship, and he was happy, and he felt obligated to call in and say the following. He says, Dr. Laura, we men are not dum-dums. We're not psychic mind readers. We don't always know what our wife is thinking. And we're not one bit unromantic. We only need clear communication, appreciation, honest love and respect. Then he said something that I think is extraordinary. He says, when we receive those things, he says, all of these gestures of kindness will be repaid by laying the moon and the stars at your feet for your pleasure. There is no need to, quote, work on a man to get what you want. We live to take care of a wife, a family, and a home. I think that's by and large true for men, at least men that are in the church. A good man may be hard to find, but not hard to keep. So when the communication is clear and when both are doing for each other, men are inspired to want to reach out and to do more. When they are harped on and nagged, they retreat. When they are criticized, for better, for worse, and almost always it's for worse, they tend to go into silent mode and disappear, or disappear mentally from the relationship. That doesn't solve anything either. Philippians chapter 2, verse 4. Philippians 2 and verse 4 and 5. Let every man not look on his own things, but every man on the things of others. Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus. Women will tend to nag when they feel that they have no more influence in making the relationship better, which is something that most every woman is passionate to do. And the most natural thing in the world is to complain, and she may be 1,000% right. As Mr. Gary Smalley said, women seem to be born with the manual in their minds, a marriage manual that knows how the relationship should play out. Sometimes they'll come to their husband in a fit of frustration and say, when are you going to get with the program? And he doesn't know what the program is. She is more in tune by nature with relationships, children, family, and understands seemingly how the circumstances should work. Typically, it's the woman that says we need to go for counseling, when sometimes that might be the appropriate option to exercise. But ironically, and this too is a mystery, that nagging doesn't effectuate or get the response that one would want. It works out differently, and it just makes everything worse, even if maybe the problem is more in his court than hers. To illustrate that, I will read an excerpt of an article from the New York Times entitled, Woodpeckers Poke Hole into Space Shuttle's Schedule. And we talk about carp, complain, and peck. Riddled with holes drilled by woodpeckers, the Space Shuttle Discovery will have to retreat to the hangar for repairs to its fuel tank insulation, forcing an indefinite postponement of the launching that had been scheduled for next week, the space agency said yesterday. Some officials said that it might not be rolled back out until August. The offending birds were the yellow woodpeckers of eastern North America that were proclaiming their territory. Technicians counted at least 6 dozen holes, some as big as 4 inches wide, on the side of the fuel tank. Some penetrated to the tank's metal wall, but did not penetrate it. At a news briefing yesterday, Al Sofsky, assistant launch director for the Space Center, said he tried to be philosophical about having one of his $2 billion spaceships designed to withstand the rigors of orbital flight, from blast-off to fiery re-entry, driven off of its launch pad by a flock of birds. Well, that's the ultimate as far as pecking. Now, poor King Solomon, he was married to 700 wives, was it, and had 1,000 concubines. I'm surprised that he didn't die of being pecked, all over his body. And to me, it's a mystery that somebody that had so much wisdom could dig his own grave like that. But when you read in the Song of Solomon, there isn't one scrap of criticism, not one peck, nothing that's negative. It's all positive communication and great passion and great chemistry between two lovers. Now, what makes these lovers so special? Do you think they were perfect people? No. Would they die for each other? Yes. You would never belittle anyone that you would die for. But there is so much chemistry. Let me take a minute to point out one major study on the subject of marriage. Top needs they derived after many, many interviews with people. Top needs / interests of men, the top needs / interests of women. We'll do the women first. Number 1, affection. Number 2, conversation. All of these are very important, significant. The third one, honesty and openness. Fourth one, financial support. There's security with that, or with him doing his part. And fifth, family commitment. There are many men that understand commitment, but it would appear in society many, many more women that understand it. You know, there seemed to be this revival a couple of years ago in the society with the Promise Keepers. But commitment is something that is very much on the mind of women. Those were the things that would come up over and over again. For the men, number 1 was sexual fulfillment. Second was recreational companion. Third was the attractiveness of a wife. Fourth was her domestic support. And fifth was her admiration. Now in the Song of Solomon, you have all 10 represented. So you've got a powerful relationship. They were almost in delirium. They were so excited for each other. It was a lot of it was maybe extra dopamine, but in the brain. But beyond that, I love your legs are like marble, and and eyeballs like pieces of marbles of gold, and things like that might be over the top with all of us. But on the other hand, the passion is incredible. That's in those pages. Now, being just honest about it, aging could diminish a few of those traits. But that's all the more reason to expand the other characteristics to fill any voids. In struggling relationships, there are numerous voids, and unfortunately, especially when it's gone from 50-50 to 20-20 and so forth, people start wandering and looking around in other areas. And if they do, maybe it's their fault for doing that. But perhaps it would be reduced if we all thought, well, what is it that means the most to my mate? What can I do to invest time and energy in those areas? Do you think that would be a good investment? Do you think that might change a relationship or two? I think so. Communication, so important. There are proverbs that echo the need for that. One is in Proverbs 19, verse 11. I'll just read that. The discretion of a person defers his or her anger, and it's his or her glory to pass over transgression. I will turn over to Romans 12 and verse 1 and 2. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Here it says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this society, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove what is acceptable and good and perfect is the will of God. This is what we're required to do for God. We could do the same thing for our mates, or our future mates. That's significant. That shows an attitude of wanting to go over and beyond. And that's why we've had the success, at least a number of us have had to be 50 and 60 years married and happily married. There was one couple made the news a few weeks ago. He's 102 and she's 100. And they are mentally sharp. They drive, they shop, they travel, and you could tell, just still giddy about each other, just thrilled to pieces. And that's what can happen. A great marriage is a relationship at its best, of two very generous people. In John 15:13, it says, "Greater love has no man than this, that he give his life for his friends." That was the example that Christ set. We need more marriages where each other will give one's life for each other. That means to be generous with time, perhaps discretionary money after meeting regular obligations, generous with knowledge and wisdom, in compliments. What does it say in Proverbs 31? It talks about, the Proverbs 31 woman is this and that and the other thing. But in the same chapter, verse 27 and 28, it says, he praises her. And oftentimes it's in front of the children. When a marriage is happy, he is typically the discloser. When it's unhappy, typically she's the one that will reveal that to at least somebody to help maybe cope with the circumstances. But in the case of the ideal situation, that woman that is exalted is able to do a lot of the things that she does because she's married to somebody that's special and encouraging and giving and is generous and gives her latitude. So if you talk about one, you've got to talk about both, the husband and the wife, in the Proverbs 31 circumstance. We even had an article, it's probably been 15 or 25 years ago now, the Proverbs 31 husband. But that is one of the keys for her to be able to achieve her potential. Conversation is easier to share when you've given your heart. And that can lead to emotional and physical affection. Where is marriage on the hierarchy of values in the average relationship? Is it leftover scraps from a busy schedule? Could it be the decline is not a huge blowout like a tire could blow out, but it could be a slow, steady leak? A husband does himself an enormous favor when he loves his wife. And sometimes men have a more difficulty in expressing that than women. Women are just more tuned to relationships. It is a strength that they have. Sometimes schedules can be enemies that crowd out time, which means that you have to schedule private time together. You have to watch for danger signs. The captain of the Titanic, the great ship Titanic, was warned 6 times by other people to change his course or slow down in a sea of icebergs. He didn't do it. I've got a relative who married for his second time, a woman who is married for her second time. And when he ended up divorced this second time, he was absolutely devastated. In the beginning of that story was the fact that in spite of his bad business practices, he had inherited some significant money. And so he was looking forward to being remarried, and this was going to be his Shangri-La moment. The girl saw what she wanted to see in him, and they married. And they had a lot of high hopes. Unfortunately, he lost the money, and his bad business practices were due to unbridled ADD. At the time, she didn't understand that, but she wanted to counsel, and he refused. Then she divorced him, and then he wanted to counsel. He couldn't believe that he was in this much trouble. You would have thought that he was the captain of the Titanic. And it's a bitter, bitter pill that he's had to swallow to this very day, so many years later. To get happily married, do you search for the perfect person? Because if so, nobody exists that's that way. With the exception of the people in this room, of course. Abraham was not yet perfect, but he was a man of God, and because of that, it was probably easier for Sarah to call him Lord. That was back at that time, a token of respect. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 6. 1 Peter 3 and verse 6 is a statement that I think we're familiar with, verse 6 and verse 7. 1 Peter 3 and verse 6, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid. Likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor to the wife, even as to the weaker vessel. That means physically, not emotionally, not spiritually. Why is a woman a weaker vessel? Because she has 20% less red blood cells and 30% less muscle mass, things of that nature. Is not quite as tall, typically, in stature. This is all on the physical level. But when husbands dwell with them and have honor to the wife and are viewing themselves as heirs together of the grace of life, their prayers are not hindered. They are blessed. The relationship is based on profound respect, and that is critical. Once you think you have a relationship like this, take it to its highest level by giving your life for that person, and then all the communication is all positive. In marriages where everything seems to have gone wrong, the option always exists to make it rebound, to bury the scorecards of wrong and to work out of a positive base. If there are still lingering or other complicating factors, you can always get counseling. Very, very significant. Now, James Dobson wrote the famous book years ago, probably 35 years ago, What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Women. A lot of practical information is in that book. More than men, women get slowed down by, as he points out, fatigue and time pressure. There are many exceptions to that. Sometimes they will have low self-esteem when their husbands would think, there's just no way why she can do so much. Women are strong enough to survive without reassurance, but when they have encouragement, they thrive on it, just as men do. Who doesn't? There's been many an athletic coach that thought they could just move in the locker room and kick people around and show how tough they are. There was one person that did that, and he coached the Minnesota Vikings for a few weeks, and there was signs of trouble when one person couldn't take it, and in the meal room, he took a bottle of ketchup. He says, hey, look at this. He'd been so criticized on the practice field, he thought that, well, I've burned my bridge. They're going to can me at the end of the week. So out of revenge, he took a bottle of ketchup and poured it over his coach's head. And after he called attention to what he was going to do, well, he was right. He was let go from the team. Think of somebody else like Tony Dungy, who coached the Tampa team for a number of years and has striven as best as he knows to be a Christian and has been very much involved in the spiritual lives of a lot of his players. And he was a disciplinarian, but he cared about his people. And they would take the criticism from him if it were appropriate, and he never did anything that wasn't appropriate. As one big burly guy said, and he had lived a wild past, wild, college parties, the world was at his feet, people fawning all over him, giving him money, throwing money at him, the alumni, everybody. The life of some of this typical like that for some of these prima donna stars. And he was unruly, and he didn't listen to anybody's authority. But for the first time in his life, he had a coach, not a parent, but his surrogate parent now, even in his 20s when nobody else would tell him what to do, a person that was like a father to him. And he said, he could just look at me cross-eyed like, how could you show up late? He says, I would melt. The man was right. Love goes a long way. Love can move mountains. People respond by love. They don't respond by criticism. Criticism only forces a person to just do the bare minimum. And the person that has to do the bare minimum or is thrown into that mindset says, so help me, I'll never go more than 50% in any relationship. But women sometimes can get slowed down by low self-esteem or isolation or loneliness. Children can isolate parents, small ones sometimes. And husbands that are tuned into that need to occasionally get the wives out of the house. Sometimes the husbands are the key to reassure, to support, to say how much they love them, and show it in 100 different ways. Like, okay, why don't we go where you want to go? Let's stop at whatever place you want to stop and shop. How much would you like to spend? What would you like to do? Well, we did what we wanted to do, or I wanted to do. What can I do for you? And it's amazing how when a wife feels, wow, this is coming in my direction, this other gift, or this time, or this, or whatever, she'll want to reciprocate. Well, why don't you, you've always liked to deer hunt. This would be a good weekend, or you could do some of these other things, and so forth. She's willing to give back, because she knows she's not giving up. She has a relationship that means something. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 28, scripture that ties into these concepts is one that's heart and core to all of Christianity. Matthew 20, verse 25 through 28. Jesus called people to him as disciples. He says, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great, or at least viewed as great by society, exercise authority. Oh, yeah. But it shall not be so with you. But whosoever shall be great among you, let him be your servant. That's the way it's translated. And whosoever shall be chief among you, let him be your servant. And even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's sacrificial love. I've seen some people try to railroad the idea that the man's the head of the house. The man makes the decisions. The man rules the roost. Rod of iron. I've never seen anybody that's thought that way reflect what we just read here in Matthew chapter 20. The two don't mix. What you see is, if man is the head of the house, God will say, well, if something didn't go right, I'm holding you responsible first. When Adam and Eve were part of the sin in the Garden of Eden, who did God go to first? And it says Adam wasn't deceived. God would hold him more responsible. But in Ephesians 5, it's talking about being in subjection one to another. So there's a lot of give and take going on. Not any lording over. Perhaps in an absolute crisis, in crunch time, somebody has to make the final decision. But only a fool would make the final decision if it had far-reaching effects, if he didn't consult with his counselor and the one that would know him best, and then the one that would perhaps be even more in tune with the needs of the family and the circumstances. So I've never seen anybody suffer or go wrong in applying Matthew 20. Now, we're not talking about extreme abusive circumstances, extenuating circumstances that might require some counseling somewhere, but I'm talking about in the mainstream of typical relationships. Typical relationships. And when we analyze this, we realize time and time again that men and women are not the same. And isn't that wonderful? That adds variety. We have to understand each other. We sometimes don't process things the same way. Men are driven by being respected. Women are most appreciated when they are loved. Men derive self-esteem from the outside world. Women derive their self-esteem primarily within the base of the home, primarily. Some women work in society, but women are more in tune with relationships, whereas men are more interested in things. Men tend to look for solutions to problems. Women can value talking even multiple times on a problem that continues to be unsolved. Here's a case in point. Husband talks to one of his friends. He says, I hate my job. And his friend says, well, then you should think of doing something else. That's not a bad idea. Yeah, I think I'll do something else. Absolutely, because, Joe, life is too short. And Joe says, yeah, I'm going to turn in my notice right now. Where a wife says, I hate my job. Husband says, well, why don't you quit? She says, well, I wasn't saying that, but you just did. No, it's hard. She may mean something totally different, or maybe she does mean she really wants to quit. But we tend to process things differently. It's not a case of one way is right and the other way is wrong. God created us to be different. And as the French said, vive la différence, if I'm close to pronouncing that. But that adds variety and spice to life, but it also does something else. It forces us to be able to be in tune with the world of the other. It demands, really, that we be givers, that we apply Christianity, which is what God wants for us to do anyway. We have to give of ourselves and overcome ourselves and get past our own carnal natures in order to be able to enhance life for somebody else or for other people or family members. So that is what Christianity is all about. And one of the primary reasons he said, when I create man, I'm going to immediately institute marriage. It'll be an opportunity, a workshop, an area where people can learn how to be happy, how to give, how to be more of themselves, how to be greater Christians, how to be able to make a difference for somebody else. And when that somebody else has that coming in that direction, they can reciprocate. Which way is better, the way of a man or the man's world, or the way of the women process information, or women's world? God created both, and lo, it was very good. The question becomes, what can I bring to the table? What can I do in my part to enhance my marriage? And as we spiritually grow, sometimes we'll raise the same thing. What more can I contribute to God, to the church? It's the same line of thought. It's it's limited by time and circumstance, perhaps. But again, what can we do? What can we do? Well, let me quickly itemize a few things, and our time will be up. Great topics of conversation, goals and aspirations. The two people going in two different directions, or do they see enough commonality to go in the same direction? Goals and aspirations. Certainly for the man of the house, he should be willing to praise her and honor her. He saw things to praise and honor originally, hence he married her. So could that continue? And couldn't he understand that she is not an interruption of his life? She is one of the reasons he exists now. That not as an interruption of his life, she probably adds color and creativity to his life. And wouldn't this be a drab world if women didn't live in it? We wouldn't have any flowers. These green plants would be gone. And everybody be wearing gray, and life could be maybe drab. At any rate, gray's okay occasionally. God even created gray hair, so we know there's no bad color, but there's more color. Women add a lot of spice to life, and we couldn't afford to not have that. But what would life be without men? Maybe everything wouldn't be pretty, but it would be rock solid and strong. Buildings, skyscrapers, cars would continue to run, the trains would arrive on time and so forth. But you need color, you need emotion, you need personality, you need a splash of all of that. And when it's all put together, it's wonderful. When you think of what a man can do and what a woman can do, maybe a woman can bake an apple pie and she can help be tuned into the needs of the children in a better way, in a way that he couldn't. But maybe he's great at changing the oil and building an addition onto the house and planning a trip somewhere. So if you combine the two, even though she might not be able to build the addition onto the house, so to speak, between the two of them can make the apple pie, build the addition, plan the trip, do all of those things. You have the strengths of both, have the benefits and the blessings of both. And that's what a good relationship can do. Perhaps there's a need for some marriage counseling. Typically, men think, wow, if I've got to counsel, then I'm a failure. It's over, man. I don't know what happened. I've failed. Well, to do nothing could spell failure. For a woman, she thinks, well, there's hope. There's hope. If we can talk about it and generate a conversation, we might be able to get somewhere. But if she has to say, what's on your mind? Talk. Open up. Then it could be very, very frustrating. But a man can be an initiator. He can be the big key in this. And of course, women, if they admire sincerely their husbands or whatever they can admire, and give in areas of interest to him, just as was said, they will go to the end of the earth to enhance the lives of their wives. There's a phrase we heard in Costa Rica one time when the men serenaded for the wives during the feast. And the way it was worded was, man, thank you for doing this, they said. It was announced to all the brethren. You really pulled down the stars of heaven for us. I never heard of a phrase like that. But pulling down the stars, wow, you doing what you can for somebody else, that means the world to the other person. That not only enhances their happiness, but inspires them to give back. This cannot be predicated on a 50-50 relationship. Happiness is not an accident. Good results are not an accident. It works best when two people are working at their best. Only one person working at one's best in a relationship can still effectuate quite a response. And sometimes the other person will unconsciously start gravitating toward a life of reciprocation and giving back. And maybe it's long overdue, but you don't say that unless there's a retreat. But giving is not giving up. Giving leads to receiving, especially when it's unconditional. And that's what's built into our marriage contract that we have. There's not too much fine print. You give to the other person, and you continually give. You don't keep score. Unless, of course, there's some outrageous issues that need to be talked over with some maybe professional in some way. Let's be thankful that marriage is an institution. It is an opportunity that we can use as a tool to grow spiritually as a Christian. It's a chance to enhance the life of other people. It's something that I think that all of us have the potential to be very, very good at. God's ways are best. God's ways work. His relationships work the best when they're based on biblical principle. Let's be thankful for that, and hence the title of this sermon, Wonderful Marriages, Yours Can Be Next.